safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I am your host, Jeremy Yoder. In each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, movies, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. My guest this episode is Jesse Bontrager. Welcome, Jesse.
Hi, Jeremy. Glad to be here.
Why don't you say a little bit, Jesse, about who you are?
I am the oldest of four children. I was raised in a Mennonite family. Happened to be a cousin of Jeremy. My dad and your mom are brother and sister. We grew up knowing each other well and continue to have a close relationship as adults. I'm married, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and we live in Delaware. I have many different things I enjoy, especially music and observation of culture, particularly in politics and in movies, and I'm not sure where to go with that.
Okay, that's fine. So Jesse, you and I grew up with somewhat different flavors of Mennonite. You're a conservative Mennonite, or at least you grew up as a conservative Mennonite. Why don't you explain a little bit about what that is and why that's different from the kind of Mennonite that I grew up as?
When I was young, we belonged to a fairly conservative Mennonite church. There were a number of items that were regulated or rules that were in place particularly about dress and about appearance. There was a great emphasis in not being conformed to the world. So nonconformity is the teaching, was a very strong concept. This is outwardly portrayed with the women wearing the head veiling or the covering in traditional Mennonite history, and other things like plain suits being worn instead of suits, no ties, dress tends to be plain. So dress obviously is a very important role, and that was the type of church that I grew up in.
So, Jesse, what was it like growing up in a church culture that was substantially different from the culture around you? You mentioned you like music and movies. What was it like to be in a culture that kind of viewed upon these things negatively?
In my experience, I was largely sheltered from a lot of those things. I did not have exposure to television when I was younger. I did not have exposure to contemporary music at all, and in very particularly no secular music. So lack of exposure means you know the families and the people and the community that you live within. There just really wasn't a lot of exposure beyond that. The first 6 years of my life, I attended the local Mennonite school, where it was largely children from families just like mine. And then for the final 6 years before graduation, we homeschooled. My parents felt like that was the best way to, I suppose, further our education in a Christian way. Again, pursuing that idea of being sheltered.
Was there a lot of concern and fear that outside influences could take you away from the church?
To some degree, I think that's true. I also think there was a strong emphasis placed on the idea that when you are living in right relationship with God, then the fruit that you bear is good fruit, and that good fruit is specifically pure from the contamination of the world.
I mean, one of the things that I remember when we were growing up, when we were teenagers and discovering girls for the first time, I remember being at church with some of our peers, and they were talking about, how much they hated billboards because they would drive by and they would see, half-naked lady on the billboard advertising something, and they would experience lust. And I realized something in that experience, and that was that our idea of sin was different. I always sort of understood sin as something that comes out of our own hungers and our own desires that we try to fill in inappropriate ways. They seem to understand sin as being something external, that it was temptation from the outside that made you do bad things, that made you feel bad things. And so the entire purpose of community was to prevent that kind of temptation. Am I correct in that kind of understanding?
I think there are differing approaches to it, and I think many conservative groups do reflect very much that idea. I will say that the teachings that our family and in particular our church that I grew up with was predicated more on the idea that the exposure to the world was potentially dangerous. And so the question of conformity had more to do with how risky were you willing to live your life? How much risk were you willing to entail? Not that the temptation itself was the sin, but if you made a strong effort to avoid any temptation whatsoever in as many ways as you could, that was reflecting a more successful Christian life.
So they did believe that it was possible to live a life without temptation if you had all the appropriate boundaries in place?
That probably is stretching it a little bit to say without temptation, but in the areas where you could avoid temptation, to make it was strongly encouraged to make those decisions to minimize temptations. For example, television represented even more and varied advertisements that used varying degrees of enticement to get you to buy their products. And so the choice that was strongly encouraged was that television would not be present in the homes when I was growing up. And so when I was young, we didn't have a TV.
So for me, what's interesting here, as you talk about this, Jesse, was, when I was about the third or fourth grade and I was back home with you guys visiting, I remember I was introduced to Star Trek in your house. The very first time I ever encountered Star Trek was Star Trek 4, the one with the whales.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, you're telling me that there was this band on television, yet I remember watching TV at your place.
So that introduces a conundrum, and that is there is many quality and educational programs that are produced. I'm not sure that Star Trek falls into the quality and educational, but it's close. And so one way to observe or to partake of those what are seen as positive items without the negative of the whole-scale television is to have a VCR. And so, of course, those were the days of VCRs before DVDs or Blu-rays and so on. When we watched Star Trek 4, that was via VCR, and there was no television associated with it. I suppose that was seen as still easier to control what is introduced into the household.
Like you have no control over what the TV brings into your home, but you have control over the VCR.
I can't defend that as being thoroughly consistent. It certainly is not thoroughly consistent. And it's complicated even further when you introduce things more recently, things like the internet and access to far more resources at a far easier manner.
I mean, I remember, too, it sounds a little bit like, for a while back there were these certain kinds of DVD players or some sort of gadget you could hook up to your DVD player that would bleep out or cut out all the objectionable content out of films. So you could watch a DVD and it would automatically cut out the curse words. And so this is kind of a weird sort of attempt to interact with culture but still control what you're exposed to.
In essence, to sanitize it. We never had the machines that filtered content. So looking back, I'm glad we didn't do that. And so on. My parents still don't have a TV. The morning of September 11th, in 2001, and I went to the local electronics store and bought an antenna because it was my desire to be able to observe the world, the broader world, in a more direct way. I have TV to this day. At this point, I'm not sure that it represents the best influences in my life, but we certainly do have it.
You seem to watch a lot of soccer on it.
I do. Soccer and election season is always a hot time around here where my wife usually is well and truly tired of debates and politics by the time that's done.
So you yourself right now, I don't think identify as a conservative Mennonite. So I wonder if you would mind talking a little bit about that journey and what took you out of that kind of sheltered life and kind of decisions that you are now making regarding your own media consumption and the way you live your life.
Growing up in addition to this very sheltered and protected method of interacting with the world and approach to the world, my parents were also very strongly encouraging of us reading a lot, of us exploring and seeking knowledge in places that were different than what many of our peers did. We always had World Book encyclopedias. We had exposure to a lot of public television, again by means of the aforementioned video cassette players, and so on. And so we had programs that were educational. In some ways, I think that is actually consistent with many of the other of my uncles and aunts and the other families in the Bontrager, the wider Bontrager family. But for whatever reason, that was a strong encouragement. And so I always grew up with that idea that go find, learn more as much as you can, find out as much as you can. Also, the idea that strongest overriding document, so to speak, that helped govern life was the Bible, but that the decision to follow what's in the Bible is something that you should make on your own. It should be your own decision. You don't fall upon it and become or adhere to it just simply because your parents did.
Right.
So those two ideas, stuck with me. And so as I became an adult and got married and still took a very active role in the church, for sure at that point I was already watching and observing the wider world around me in a different way than I had when I was younger. But I still largely held to the same practices and so on. Through a number of experiences, both things in the community taking place, things at my job taking place, and then probably in the most key area, my wife and I struggled with infertility for the first 10 years of our marriage. And those things kind of all combining together brought me to a place where I realized that the process that I experienced growing up and as a young person, process of adhering to faith and to practice as enacted here in the conservative church didn't work for me at all. And that has kind of led me to be at quite a different place today than I was earlier. At the same time, another strong element in my worldview also had to do with the politics of this time period that I was experiencing, particularly over the Bush administration and what I think would deem completely ill-advised war in Iraq. That had a profound effect on my life as well, to the point where I realized that without much hesitation that I saw the rest of the world from a very liberal perspective. And yet this whole church side of things was a very conservative side. I spent a couple of years trying to balance those two and really kind of got myself into some really dark places and depression and all kinds of challenging experiences. I realized that trying to balance and keep everything and understand everything, make everything make sense, was not working at all. At this point, I feel like I am very liberal in my worldview, and that also carries over to things like approach to church and approach to the broader community here where I live now.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the politics then. I mean, just a background here. Historically, Mennonites have not been political. In the past, Mennonites refused to serve in the military, they refused to vote, they refused to swear oaths in court, anything like that would sort of ensnare them in the political system. But that kind of has changed, Jesse, is that correct?
In varying degrees, certainly. There are still very conscientious conservative Mennonites who are very carefully non-involved in political things. Yet, in this, there is an element that, in my opinion, does lie on the conservative side in terms of worldview, but not so much conservative in terms of dress and so on. And there has been a really strong push to join with the evangelical churches in a sort of nationalism and what seems to me to be a very inconsistent support for warlike activities and kind of a skepticism of peaceful proceedings. And so these elements are here as well. Now, in the community where I live, my dad and a number of his peers are still non-involved. But many in the larger community are very involved. They vote regularly. Their primary causes are being opponents to abortion. I suppose they get into, or the same-sex marriage debate is a challenging one, and the majority of the conservative groups in this area are very strongly opposed to that, to equality there.
I mean, one of the things that I struggle sometimes with our grandfather, who just recently passed away, was that, I remember, he had actually served as a conscientious objector during World War II. But during, after 9/11, I remember when Grandpa started listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I remember when Grandpa began to express support for military action, particularly in defense of Israel. I've always had a hard time reconciling these two things.
Yeah, I agree. And Grandpa's abiding love was for the Bible, and sort of by extension, he was a very strong proponent and very strong interest in Israel. There were times when I felt that he tried to be a bit fair and objective about it, but then there was other times when, and I think as he got older, I think it got less and less objective and more, very partisan on his perspective. And his perspective was defense of Israel is really the only thing that matters. If Israel was under threat, then the rest of the world should rise to their aid.
I remember when Arafat passed away that Grandpa was really happy about that, and he had this political cartoon that showed Arafat being dragged off by death, and he just kind of laughed over it. It was really awful.
Yeah, that's not good. That's not good. I agree with your assessment that it is. It seems like a double standard. It seems like we strive to be a peaceful people, unless our friends over in Israel are the ones who need to be stood up for. Then let's go in and bomb anybody we want. And it's a dangerous place to come out in terms of international politics anyway.
I think Grandpa and Grandma, too, on some level, wish they were, in some sense, Jewish, felt a strong sort of affinity for Jews because wanting to be God's sort of people and God's chosen people. And I think they identified with that in a way maybe that wasn't always very healthy.
Very, very true. One of their favorite organizations was Jews for Jesus, and they were Messianic Jews, Jewish heritage, but who had accepted Jesus as a Messiah and were in belief they were Christian, but then they did celebrate a lot of the older Jewish customs and holiday feasts and so on. And Grandpa loved that.
Yeah, I have some Jewish friends who are not very thrilled about Jews for Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, too, though, about Grandpa that was interesting, that despite all that, in his 80s, he read the Quran. And I remember he had a marking system where, he marked, he would highlight parts of the Quran. Part of it was, biblical, and the other one part was not biblical. Which is kind of offensive if you think about it in those terms. But this wasn't, a conservative Mennonite pastor in his 80s who was reading the Quran, which I think was really unusual, and trying to understand it.
I think that's very highly unusual. I'm proud of him for the effort to look beyond his own comfort zone, but I also recognize he and I didn't necessarily come out of the same place on those items.
So, in what ways, you don't identify yourself now as a conservative Mennonite. So, what do you identify? Do you have a faith now, or are you agnostic or atheist? Where do you find yourself these days?
I think I'm most comfortable with the word, or with identifying myself as a skeptic, and I would probably identify most closely with agnosticism, simply because I guess I would describe it that my faith experience, I have not found the faith that I had to be sufficient when confronted with the absence of direct intervention of a deity. And so I would not say, I accept that I know, that there are large gaps in my knowledge, and so I will not argue and say there is no God categorically, but I would say that the evidence, insofar as I can see it or accept it or experience it, I am motivated far more by the things that are around us here and that we can do and can see.
So is it part of it feels that faith feels like it's pie in the sky kind of stuff? Is that what it is, the objective?
I suppose to some degree, yes. So I don't identify with conservative Mennonites, or and in some degree, I'm not sure that I identify in church at large either. But I do live very closely with a large number of other very faithful, very devout people, and I have a great deal of respect for them. And I am not at all evangelical in my unbelief, meaning I don't go around and try to convince other people that they need to view things the same way I do. So I find it, for me, it is better to hold on to the relationships that I have. Those relationships are valuable to me, but the actual participation in faith is something that it's not something I experience these days.
At our grandfather's funeral a few weeks ago, the cousins sang a couple songs at the funeral. One was "How Beautiful Heaven Must Be," and another one was "There's a Land That Is Fairer Than Day," often known as "In the Sweet By and By." These are songs about escape, that the entire purpose of being here on earth was to escape in heaven. And these are these old camp songs. And I have to say, Jesse, I object to that kind of theology myself. This idea that we're only here on earth until, we have got enough bonus points, brownie points with God, that we can be rescued from this world when we pass away. To me, that's not a good theology. I think when I read Scripture, what I see is, we are to live into the kingdom of God here on earth in the way that we treat each other, in the way that we treat others, and pursuing justice, those kinds of things. To me, it is not that escape.
Yeah, I agree. I think probably my largest objection to that is how it devalues the here and now. It allows us to make decisions that are not kind, that are not thoughtful of the other people who we live with, and instead allows us to focus on the future, the distant future. It is interesting. I will say that it is interesting and challenging to rub shoulders daily and weekly, and to be part of families that have very strong belief in that. And there are times there are times when I don't feel like I fit in very well because of my own challenges here. But other times I wouldn't want to take away any of the belief that they have, and I want to be supportive of them because I care about them.
So your own wife dresses as a conservative Mennonite, continues to wear a head covering. Was that difficult for her as you sort of shifted in your own faith?
Sure. It's been a transition for us. It's been something that I think that we have thrived in our marriage because we are such close friends of each other, and not because we believe the same things. And so when these belief challenges have occurred, it has certainly been something tough for us to work through. It's been something to deal with. But I have been very fortunate in her support of me and my faith journey. And as such, I also want to continue to be supportive of her, even if I may not be at the exact same place. Another teaching that is strongly held, and I suppose this is not just conservative Mennonites, but also broader evangelical church as well, the idea that it's important for the man to take the leadership role and to make the decisions and to be the one to decide what is done and how it's done and so on. And this is the way I was raised and so on. In our marriage, it is far more of a partnership where we make decisions together and we have conversation over everything. And so in matters of dress that continue today, I am supportive of the decisions that she makes in that. But it's not the kind of thing where I say you will dress this way or you won't dress this way, and so on.
I mean, that must have been a bit of a crisis if you're supposed to be the head of the household and you are moving away from the conservative faith.
As I look back at it, I realized that from the very beginning of our marriage, which was well before the challenges of faith that I've had, we had already started dealing with marriage on an equal footing, and in some ways, I think that prepared us so that we weren't just completely devastated by this loss of the distinct status quo of how it is done, and so on.
So, in what ways do you still find yourself as, there's an little conservative Mennonite inside of you? In what ways do you find yourself still being a conservative Mennonite? In what ways do you still carry with you your childhood?
I still enjoy many of the practices or the customs, things like the 4-part singing that we did, 4-part a cappella singing. I still enjoy that, and it's fun to hear the singing done well. And I think back to the funeral several weeks ago, the singing there was just terrific. It sounded great. I'm not ashamed to say that I still enjoy that very much. I still have twinges of things like when the fair comes around. The fair was something that was, out of bounds. We didn't go to the fair when I was young.
You're talking about this. You're talking about the state fair.
Yes, the state fair. And so when the state fair opens, and if we have the occasion to go, which we don't go every year that it's on, but when we do, and we walk in, and the Ferris wheel is there, and all of the screaming carnival barkers, and the hubbub, and just the people, and all these, it's still, there's a little bit of me that feels like, maybe I shouldn't be here.
Well, what was so wrong about the fair? Why was that out of
You're
bounds?
asking the wrong person. It was a place where very worldly things happen.
Like carnival games.
Yeah,
huh?
carnival games.
So it was just a very kind of wicked, worldly place with bad influences.
Yeah, and it's funny that even as an adult, as I go back, it's relatively harmless in the sense that it's a lot of farm animals and the rides for kids and tons of poorly nutritious food and so on. The idea of alcohol is only now gaining traction there, where craft beers are part of the competitions and things like that.
It was just a symbol for something that was verboten.
Yeah, sure. And when the emphasis is on protecting families and protecting children from exposure, conversely, the emphasis is on spending your time with people from your own community that are very homogenous. And so that was outside of our experience, and instead our pastime and the games we played and the activities we did were within the confines of the Mennonite community that we lived in.
Yeah, I remember lots of volleyball games.
Volleyball games, pepper picking in the summer. And these are all good things. Like I don't think that I don't think that it's wrong to do those things. I grew up with a very stark contrast between us and them, or us and the world. And as I've gotten older, I realized that as people we are very, very similar to the people that we live, that are neighbors and the coworkers that we are not, that it is not this stark difference. We are all people. And in my experience and the choices as I can choose for my daughter, I don't want to build those walls and say, you must only be with the people that are like you, or you must be only with the people who believe the same as you. I think there's value in reaching across cultural lines, reaching across even different languages and backgrounds. And I think there's a lot more value in that wide embrace than there is in a very narrow focus.
So you're not raising your daughter with the same kind of shelteredness that you were?
No, I think that's safe to say.
So Jesse, is there anything else you might like to say tonight?
I think I would say this. Challenges of faith can take us many places, and we have different approaches to them, and some end satisfactorily and some don't, and some are easier and some are harder. I think that's for each person to work out for themselves. In my experience, one of the things that has been a strength for me has been the involvement of family in my life and in the context that we live in. And so even as it's easy for me to say, well, I think that withholding exposure for children and for families to only a small community or only people we know or families in some cases, it's easy for me to say that I don't agree with that. And yet that same family, the tight family dynamic, the families that care about each other and go out of their way to show that, those are, I count that as a benefit in my life. So I think there is strong value in finding the family members, and in sometimes family members aren't the people that are, our family. There's family members that are not blood related to us, but the people who will walk close to us and be with us hand in hand through struggles like that. Finding those people, I think, I think that's a very, very important and a strength that can be tapped into.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it. You know, I was thinking about the famous quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, not all who wander are lost. And I think that's often true in our own journeys of faith and discovery and trying to understand what we believe in the world around us. And just because we are wandering does not mean necessarily that we have been lost.
That's a favorite quote of mine, and I appreciate that sentiment as well.
Well, anyway, thank you, Jesse, very much for coming on. I really appreciated this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jeremy.
If you like Geek Cross, you can help us out by leaving us a review on iTunes. You can send us an email at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Our Twitter handle is @geekcrossshow. This is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.